Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience.
To their great regret, they lived at different ends of the village. You might think that in a village there are 2 or 3 streets and you can get to your girlfriend in a few minutes. But their village was very, very big, and in the mornings a bus would go around to pick up the kids and take them to school. Catherine's mother was a teacher, and their house was a stone's throw from the school. So Lucy often stayed overnight at Catherine's house, especially in winter, when the frost was fierce. The girls were unlikely to become friends. Lucy came from a family delicately labeled dysfunctional. Her father left her mother with 4 children, and Lucy was the eldest. Her mother drank, and that's something you can't hide in the village, much less a new friend 10 years younger than you. And the house was a very bad old one, probably from the 50s of the last century. Old, wooden. We could only dream of any amenities. We got water from a column, and in winter we stoked the stove. And the worst thing was that all 6 people lived in one room, the mother and her friend and the children. And when the mother was drunk, which happened almost every day, she didn't care whether there was food in the refrigerator or not. The neighbors called the neighbors, and inspectors started to visit the house, looking at the ragged, unkept children who looked like orphans. In the end, the children were taken to the city and transferred to a rehabilitation center, sort of temporarily to see if the mother would come to her senses or not. Otherwise, she was threatened with deprivation of parental rights. Only Lucy went to school, and Ekaterina's mother was her class teacher. She was supposed to visit Lucy at the center to see how she was doing. Natalie bought sweets, coloring books, colored pencils, and went. Nothing from this program was missed. Natalie heard that only 200 grams of Karoffa candy could be brought in. She was allowed to see Lucy for 20 minutes, and all that time she cried, clinging to the young teacher, who had not been well liked before. She desperately longed for the center and said that she was better off with her mother, even if she was hungry at home, even if her mother drank, but it was still her mother. And here in the center, her mother had never come to see her. Back in the village, Natalie, without going home, went to Walker's house. "Listen, Naomi," she said to the woman who, to put it plainly, was drunk again. "Your fate is being decided now. You're going to lose the most precious thing you have." And she painted in colors that Naomi was about to lose her parental rights, and then her children would be whisked away to foster homes. They're still small, pretty, healthy. I'm told they'll take them in a heartbeat, and you'll be all alone, like a finger. And if you ever want to have another baby, you're already sick yourself. Look at your drunken face. You'll give birth to an invalid or a freak, and you'll suffer with him for the rest of your life, unless you hand him over to the state again. Natalie managed to find words that made Naomi cry. She must have realized how serious the situation was. It was agreed that she would be put in a drug treatment center and then coded. "No one will hire me after this," Naomi cried. They wouldn't hire her for any responsible and bread and butter position, of course. Natalie didn't deceive her, but as a janitor, for example, quite well, "I'll talk, you just get better." And a few months later, against the neighbors' predictions, everything worked out. Naomi got coded and was hired to clean the area around the village administration. The wages were small, but there were no delays. In addition, there were some kind-hearted women who provided constant help, bringing Naomi's children things that their own children had grown out of, as well as some groceries. They all had their own gardens, kept livestock, and had something to share. Natalie got Lucy free lunches at school. In addition, she began to invite the girl home to study with her in addition to her abilities. And her mother, seeing a D in her daughter's diary, could take up her belt and say, "Do you want to be as poor as me? You're going to take up the bottle like me? It's not going to happen. Go and study, you bastard." Natalie sat Lucy down to do her homework, explained the material if she didn't understand something at school. And just like that, Lucy became friends with her daughter Catherine. Now, when classes were over, Lucy often ignored the school bus and walked with Catherine. Her friend's house seemed to her like a paradise on earth. It was just an ordinary, middle-class country house, but very clean and well-maintained. Natalie had come to the village to work with little Catherine in her arms, and she had never talked about the girl's father, but she seemed to be coping with her new life. The children at school loved her and a little bit afraid of her, as it was impossible to get a good grade from her. And at home, she had time to do everything and check notebooks, and knit beautiful napkins, and grow roses in the front garden. Lucy never tired of admiring the embroidery, the lace runners, the shiny black piano, the porcelain figurines. Once for her birthday, Natalie gave her a gift of a potted white indoor rose. Lucy carried it home like a jewel. A few days later, her stepfather, who was still drinking, mistook sugar for salt, poured 3 spoonfuls into his tea, and then, out of frustration, splashed the salted boiling water right on the poor flower. Later, Lucy thought that she could forgive her stepfather for many things, but not this rose. He knew that Lucy was afraid to breathe on it, and yet, Catherine and Lucy were very different, but they were still very good together. Catherine loved to read and masterfully retold what she had read, so Lucy only hailed. She was naive and trusting in this respect. She did not realize that the writer had made it all up, and she took his flight of fancy for reality. In turn, she was a master of inventing different games, not always safe, and Catherine, who had not previously had a close friend, all this is terribly fascinating. And if in early childhood girlfriends were limited to the fact that arranged a house under the bed, dragged their pillows, candle and tell each other different scary stories, burned accidentally mattress does not count, then in 8th grade, they almost brought their mothers to a heart attack, going at night in the forest to look for blooming fern. Of course, they did not hope to find the treasure. It was more a test of their own courage to go into the forest at night, whether they were weak or not. Lucy was once again flogged after this adventure, and her girlfriend was locked up at home for a week. It was a great distress to Lucy to learn that Catherine would be leaving for the city after 9th grade to go to medical school. "This is a chance," Ekaterina said, as usual, thinking seriously and sensibly. "There is a huge competition in medical schools, and it is quite possible that I will not pass. It would be easier to get in after college, especially for evening classes." "You'll never come back here," Lucy said bitterly. "You'll meet someone in town, get married, and that's it. You'll visit your mother once in a while and give her grandchildren for the summer. It's good if you come to see me too." "No," Catherine argued. "I am, on the contrary, thinking of going back, only with a diploma. We have a hospital, but there is no one to work. The only doctor comes once a week. You go to him to invite him to the patient, and he jokes, 'Well, if you pour me a drink, then so be it, I'll come in.' That's no big deal, and we have so many old people here. What is it like for them to get to the hospital in the district center in a crowded bus?" But Lucy only waved her hand. Only now she realized that this friendship, like the sun, had lit up her whole life. Without Catherine, everything seemed bleak and hopeless. Lucy had a premonition that everything would go wrong, and so it did. Her mother wouldn't let her go to the city with her friend, and Lucy decided to finish the full course of school. Going to class seemed more fun than getting a job. In her senior year of high school, Lucy had a remarkably good figure. High breasts, lush hips, long legs. Boys began to chase after her, and her mother repeatedly remarked that it was better to marry early than to go out with one or the other. "Choose a better guy and go with God," my mother told me. "You'll take care of the household and bring up the children. And let your man take a job on a shift somewhere, earning money." Such a fate seemed ideal to her mother, especially since she had seen several examples before her eyes. There were very few jobs for women in the village, such as saleswoman, postmistress, and even then, you still had to get a job, and there was a queue for all these jobs. Another thing was to take the money earned by her husband and not to bow down to strangers. But life decided otherwise. Unexpectedly for herself, Lucy had an affair with Harvey. He was nearly twice her age, had buried his first wife, and had become a kind of hermit. You had to go all the way through the village and deep into the woods to find the path that led to his hut. Harvey was the best hunter in the village, and he was the one they ordered the meat that could not be found in the stores. He was good with the woods, and a good-looking man, and many women would have gone to his sturdy, self-built house. But one day he ran into Lucy at the store, and they got to talking and joking. "You're supposed to see the girls off, but I'll let you see me off," Harvey said. "See how I live." Lucy felt that this man was a head taller than the boys who were after her. He took care of Lucy and looked after her so that she, who had never known real love, neither parental nor the kind of love they write about in books, was drawn to him. But her mother met the news that Lucy was getting married with fear. "You don't know what you're in for," she said. "Harvey's house is nice, I'll grant you that, but he'll tear you away from people. It's easy to sit in a den at a young age with nowhere to go, and if you need anything, you'll have to go 3 miles away for the essentials. But Lucy was caught up in the wind, and right after graduation, she signed with Harvey and moved to his cabin in the woods, telling her mother goodbye. "Don't be sad for me, you've got 3 brothers to raise. Thank you for not putting me in an orphanage." They even cried on each other's shoulder, but Lucy could not afford to prolong this scene. Her husband was waiting for her. A new life had begun. At first, Lucy enjoyed being the mistress of the spacious, clean hut. Harvey had enough money, and soon the young wife had transformed the house beyond recognition, and now she could feel a woman's hand in the house. But the months passed. Summer was followed by fall, and Lucy began to grow bored. Now she understood her mother's words more and more. Indeed, she had locked herself in these 4 walls, sitting here alone. Harvey had a job every day. When he wasn't hunting, he was fishing, and he was building a new bathhouse and a large cellar. Lucy wondered what her husband's plans were for the future. It was understandable to her if he decided to save up some money and then sell his forestry and move somewhere else, maybe to the sea, to a warm place. But after having a conversation about it once, then another, she realized that her husband wasn't going to change anything. "Look how nice it is here," Harvey urged. "Freedom. No neighbors on all sides, no squabbling, no arguments, no drunken fights. Everything's ours, no one's in charge. Just birds singing and pine trees making noise. And what about the sea? I was once in Sochi, in the army. We were doing construction work there. The people will seem like herrings in a barrel. Everywhere you go, you have to pay money and overpriced. No, you can't lure me there." But he himself thought anxiously that the young wife was bored. Maybe some of the relatives would agree to come and keep her company, or else Lucy wouldn't be able to stand it. She would run away. For the time being, the young woman went to see her mother a couple of times a month. Each time she asked if she had heard anything about Catherine, but there was no news. Even if Lucy met Natalie on the street, she could only say that Catherine was graduating from college and still dreamed of going to college. And on her next visit, Lucy ran in to see the paramedic at the hospital, after which she told her mother, "Well, that's right, I wasn't wrong. You'll soon have a grandson or granddaughter." She didn't seem like the kind of mother who would make a doting grandmother, having babysat her own children in her time. Her mother showed her concern for Lucy by drawing her eyebrows together and asking, "At least come home for these months. You don't know what's gonna go wrong." "The ambulance takes 5 hours to get to our village, by the way," Lucy replied, "because there's only one ambulance and a lot of calls. So if you think about bad things, you should move to the city and rent a room opposite the medical center. Don't worry, I'm young and healthy, everything will be fine." One thing neither Lucy nor her mother could predict. Maybe the young woman's hormones were acting unpredictably, but she was getting more and more nervous and crying, and reached for alcohol to comfort herself. Literally, Harvey always had alcohol, and soon Lucy couldn't do without taking a little of it at bedtime. How it would affect the baby worried her less and less. Literally, Harvey always had alcohol, and soon Lucy couldn't do without taking a little of it at bedtime. How it would affect the baby worried her less and less. In the end, the mother almost by force took her daughter to her house shortly before her due date, and Lucy was delivered by a village midwife. The boy Tony was born, lightweight, weak, but seemingly without significant abnormalities. Luckily, Lucy realized that such a tiny baby did not belong in a forest hut and lived with her son in the village until May came and it was warm. These months were difficult for her. On the one hand, there was some life and people around. There were 15 stores in the village alone. True, most of them were tiny in old wooden houses or even in carriages. But there was also a magnet and a piataraka. What you need you can go and buy. Harvey brought in money. And socializing while you walk along the streets, you're bound to meet people you know, and it's like reading a newspaper. They'll tell you all the news, all the gossip. On the other hand, her brothers were growing up, and the small house was cramped, and her mother, with whom Lucy had never found common ground, loaded her with work. "Come on, I'll sit with Tony, and you go to the garden, milk the goats, get some water. We've got laundry to do today. Big cleaning." And Lucy had gotten used to being bossed around. Lately, she had only had to take care of her husband, but now she had so many other things to take care of. She had to nurse little Tony and work for the good of the family. And if at home, it was partly redeemed by the fact that Harvey loved and appreciated his wife, but here Lucy saw no gratitude. Everyone took the results of her labor for granted. Her brothers didn't even wash their plates, and try every day not only to prepare the food, but also to wash all the dishes when the water must be carried from the calm. Lucy felt like a servant for the first time, and she didn't like it. She wished even more fervently that her life could be different. Lucy realized that she couldn't do much on her own. No profession, a small child in her arms. But if Harvey wanted to, she decided, when she got home, to persuade him to move elsewhere. Some big city. Harvey's a handyman, he'll find work. And when her son's a little older, Lucy will learn something too. Why not become a cook, for instance? Get a job in a cafe or even in a restaurant and earn money, and food at home will be, and the environment around is certainly not a wooden hut with cockroaches, which cannot be removed. These plans seemed achievable, but it happened that Lucy met a neighbor who told her the news about her ex-girlfriend. "Do you know about Catherine?" she asked. "What's the matter?" said Lucy. For some reason, she wanted Catherine to have some misfortune to make her friend's life even worse than her own. Then all of Lucy's actions would seem to be justified. Yekaterina was supposed to be smart, and everything went wrong for her. Didn't she want to go to medical school? Well, she didn't. She graduated with a red diploma, got married, and came to our district center. They say she went on a wedding trip to Italy, and now she and her husband have such a nice house. Yekaterina got a job at the hospital, and the people there were very keen on her. They promised to give her a target referral to the institute in a couple of years, so that she would get in for sure. But I don't know what plans she has for the future. She is expecting a child now. Does he come here? Lucy asked. She convinces Natalie to sell her place here and move to the district center to live together. I think there's a house for sale next door to Cadius. But until it works out, of course, Catherine will visit her mother, so you'll meet her here many times. Lucy went to her room, and her heart was bitter. It seemed to her fair that fate should equalize them with Catherine in some respects. For instance, if Lucy had had a poor childhood, and Catherine had had a well-to-do one, then let fate deal her at least some blow. At least let her have no children. But no, Catherine got everything from life. Even abroad has already been abroad, and Lucy could not dream of it. And she probably already has a car, and the child's parents will take her to the sea every year, and Tony will only have a forest around and nothing else. Lucy imagined the scene. Somewhere in the same store, where she is filling a basket with cereal, pasta, and butter, she meets Catherine. She is dressed up. Her purchases are a cake and a bottle of wine, and even this she doesn't have to carry in her hands. Her car is waiting for her, and she offers Lucy a ride, and everyone's watching. It's a picture. One friend has achieved everything she wanted, and the other, no matter how hard she fought, has not managed to rise in this life. "I'm coming home," Lucy announced to her mother. And no matter how much she protested, her daughter's decision was adamant. Harvey was glad he missed his family. When his wife and son arrived, he made everything as comfortable as possible for them. He made a crib so big he didn't even need a crib. A bathtub for the baby, a cupboard to store the baby's things. He took care of everything. But if Lucy for some time was kept in frames, she did not dare to drink in front of her mother. She would have smelled alcohol a mile away, and Lucy would not be well. But now all the brakes were removed. Now, as soon as Harvey left in the morning, Lucy would pour herself a glass and drink it in 2 sips while doing her chores. Then came another drink, and then another. Often her husband would return and find the young woman asleep, and yet he didn't have the heart to reproach her. He loved her very much, and so it went on until disaster struck. Wet and hungry, Tony fidgeted in his crib, but failed to wake his mother with his cries. The baby ended up just falling on the floor. And in the evening, when his father returned, he was still crying, and his hand was swollen, and he wouldn't let her touch it. "I'd only looked away for a moment," Lucy said, averting her eyes. "He's getting so fast, you can't keep track." But Harvey kept looking at his wife, and she realized that he had guessed everything. "I'll go to the hospital with him tomorrow," Lucy declared. "No, we can't wait here." Harvey got up. "I'm going to call a friend. He'll pick us up in his car, and we'll go to the hospital." Lucy was horrified at the prospect. It would be a nightmare if she were to be put with the baby. And the doctors will attack her, will call her an irresponsible mother, and things she has no suitable will be in the ward, will look the most shabby, and most importantly, it is the fiefdom of Catherine will have to bow to her to play the former friendship. But on the other hand, she did not know how to explain to her husband that she did not want to go to the doctors. While Lucy was trying to think of something, Harvey called a friend, told his wife to pack the child, and an hour later, they were already at the district hospital. Tony's arm was broken, but Lucy's darkest premonitions did not come true. Catherine was out of work and had recently given birth to a daughter. Not long ago, Lucy would have taken the opportunity to seek her, and Catherine would have run to her, of course, to bring her the program. And how many things they would have found to chat about. But now the young woman wanted only one thing, that they should not meet. And they didn't. When Lucy and her son were discharged home, she found that there was no more alcohol in the house. "You thought you were hiding from me, but I knew everything. I thought maybe you'd bond with your kid, stop drinking. Turns out you killed Tony for what you want. I'm telling you something, Lucy, I'm serious. I grew up here, this is my life, and I'm not going anywhere. And if you're sick of it, if you can't stay here with me, there's God, as they say, and there's the threshold. But I can't rely on you, and I'm not giving you Tony." "What are you going to do with him?" Lucy asked ironically, though in her heart she was afraid. "I'll find another woman," Harvey said simply, "someone to raise my son and be my friend. It's not easy to find one, but I can do it. So think about it, please, and don't count on the court. No matter how hard you try, I'll sue you for the baby. The doctors at the hospital were afraid to put you with a boy. You were barely on your feet, and alcohol stinks a mile away. So there are witnesses." Lucy knew what Harvey said she would do. For the first time in her life, she had to pull herself together, and life began to get back on track. Tony grew up, and his father loved him more and more. As soon as the boy started to walk well, his father started taking him with him. First on small trips to the forest, where he familiarized him with trees, bushes and herbs, with all kinds of animals and birds. Soon Tony could distinguish unmistakably the voices of birds, knew which bird was nesting in which nest and which eggs were being laid. He understood mushrooms and berries, distinguishing edible from poisonous. But it turned out that the boy liked drawing the most. Realizing that his son would be bored without friends, Harvey brought children's books, paints, pencils, and albums. At first Tony had nothing to do but copy pictures from books. He especially liked to do it in the long fall and long evenings. Mother and father began to marvel at what a son has a steady hand and an accurate eye. The drawings turned out no worse than the originals, and his mother hung them on the walls. And when he got older, Tony began to draw from life. No one taught him. He somehow got to everything by himself. And he liked much better than going hunting with his father to find some beautiful corner in the forest and sit there with his sketchbook. And yet there was a special bond between father and son. Harvey devoted every spare moment to Tony. When it was time for the boy to go to school, his father did not want to send him to boarding school. It was agreed that he would tutor Tony himself, so the boy would be homeschooled. For the time being, Harvey said, "When the boy gets older, you can't do anything about it. We'll figure out a way to organize his studies. Maybe we'll send him to your mother's for a while. Grandmother's place is better than the government's." However, these plans were not to be realized. Naomi died before her grandson finished high school. Of course, the house was not empty. Lucy's brothers took it over, but none of them would take the boy in. They rarely saw him, and he was practically a stranger to them. But the biggest disaster came a little later. Before New Year's Eve, father and son went on a long fishing trip. Harvey wanted to treat the family to a good fish on the holiday table. That the weather would change so suddenly and abruptly no one had foreseen. And Lucy found herself trapped, outside in the cold and blizzard, with no family around. She tried to call one of Harvey's acquaintances, but the connection was a mess. The young woman would run out of the house, make her way to the gate, and crying, try to see something in the thickening darkness. Then she returned home, fell exhaustedly on her bed, and sobbed into her pillow. It was not until the next day, when the blizzard abated and Harvey and Tony had not returned, that a search for them was organized. Lucy knew which lake they had gone to and hoped that they had not lost their way, having decided to return when the blizzard began. But no, the man and the boy were found quite quickly. Harvey had dug a sort of cave in the snow and wrapped his son in warm clothes he had taken off himself. Maybe he hoped he was a hardened man who would survive, or maybe he didn't care anymore and wanted only to save his son at any cost. Anyway, he froze to death, and Tony was sent to the hospital in serious condition. His fingers and toes had to be amputated, and the doctors did not guarantee that this would be the end of it. This time Lucy was not admitted to the hospital with her son. The boy was considered big enough to be in the ward on his own. But she didn't care about that. She had to organize the funeral, the wake, and think about what to do next. And while Lucy had held her own in recent years and had not taken alcohol in her mouth, now she had fallen into a state of prostration and her old habits began to return. Tony was having a very hard time. Even though he had been given painkillers, his bandaged arms and legs hurt a lot. He could not entertain himself with anything, neither turn the pages of a book, nor draw. It was a strange, unfamiliar environment, and even his mother, to whom he was not so attached, was not around. Once Tony heard one of the nurses call him Mowgli. He was a completely wild boy from the forest. But he had already read the book, and he was offended to hear such a nickname. Aunt Catherine, the head nurse, felt sorry for him most of all. She found time to do her nursing duties when it came to Tony, feeding him from a spoon, serving him a vessel. It was like she was his own aunt. And when Tony felt a little better, when the pain began to recede and the longing for his father and home came first, Aunt Catherine said, "I'll bring you my Barbara tomorrow. It'll be more fun." And indeed, the next day she brought her daughter Barbara to the hospital. The girl was a little younger than Tony, but still the same age. He was even afraid he was sure they wouldn't be able to be friends. The girl was so pretty, dressed up, with blonde pigtails, and he himself looked like a man who should have been frightened away. Frostbitten face, bandaged limbs. But Barbara acted friendly and easy. She sat down on the chair next to the bed. "Mom told me you have such an interesting life," she began. Tony glanced at her apprehensively. Maybe she'd think he was a wild Mowgli too. "You're lucky," Barbara said. "Not lucky that you went to the hospital, of course, but lucky that you live in the woods with animals. My mom only let me have a cat. She's really smart and, she has a sense of responsibility. We took her when she was very young. She just learned to drink milk. And now she comes out of the house in the mornings before everyone else, runs through the yard, looks in the garden, in the manger, in the barn. Not a single mouse left. And what song she sings. I wanted to ask you, do we have wolves in the woods? My dad took me to the zoo and showed me a wolf. I don't think he's scary at all, just like a dog. My dad said that you should be afraid of wolves when they gather in packs." Tony had a lot to say on the subject of animals, and soon he found himself talking to the girl at ease, and she was asking him more and more questions, and it was obvious that she was interested in listening to him. Then Barbara snapped to attention. "I'm silly. My mom gave me different presents, and I forgot to give you a treat." She pulled an appetizing smelling container of food out of the bag, and Tony looked embarrassed, and Barbara noticed it. "Let's play like you're a wounded warrior and I'm a nurse and I'm taking care of you. I need to feed you, okay?" And Tony had no choice but to nod. They were talking and playing a game, and so the time flew by before the end of the working day. Catherine went to pick up her daughter and they had to go home. "Will you come again?" Tony asked her so hopefully that Barbara looked at her mother questioningly. "Can we do that?" "Tony, she'll definitely come, just on the weekends, okay? I mean, Barbara goes to school and then she does her homework at home. And it's not like I can come pick her up, bring her here, then take her back. But on Saturday and Sunday, Barbara will visit you. I'm glad you two are becoming friends. So what can I get you next time? Would you like a brownie or some fruit?" Barbara wanted to tell her mother how amazed she was that Tony had seen and tasted tangerines from her hands for the first time in his life. But she looked at the boy and restrained herself from speaking so as not to embarrass her buddy. Barbara was a tactful girl, and Catherine patted Tony on the head. She wanted to caress him all the time, as if she felt that the boy was neglected at home. She was also aware of how difficult his life would be, and how much effort he would have to make not to feel sorry for himself, but to learn to enjoy what was available to him. She knew his father only a little, but she liked Harvey. He seemed responsible, kind, and considerate. If he were still alive, he would be a support for his son. But what would it be like for Tony with a mother whose behavior was impossible to predict? And for Lucy, it is also a challenge to suddenly find herself with an invalid son in her arms. Barbara didn't want to wait for the next weekend and came up with a solution. When she came home from school, she tried to do her homework as soon as possible. And if she could do them quickly, she asked her grandmother to take her to the hospital. And she herself felt sorry for the boy and was sure to collect him a transfer. Already in the store, she picked up something for the sick. She put bananas in a basket or chocolate, At home, she baked pies. But Tony was not waiting for Barbara because of the goodies, although he was always happy to receive them. For the first time, he had a friend with whom they could speak the same language. Grown-ups are different after all. Barbara's stories opened up a whole world for him. The girl had already been somewhere with her parents. She told Tony about the sea in southern cities, about the train they traveled back and forth, even about her ordinary life, about school, about teachers and boys, about her strict grandmother who made her rewrite her homework if there was a single mark in her notebook. Tony had none of that, and he listened mesmerized. He himself was desperate to draw. It was his nature to pour all his impressions and feelings onto paper. But then he clearly realized that he could no longer draw as before. An adult would have given up, but childhood doesn't know the word no. Tony began to think that maybe he could learn to hold a brush or a pencil in his teeth. She even wanted to ask Barbara to bring him some pencils and a sketchbook. But he was shy. He foresaw that he wouldn't succeed at first, and he didn't want to show her the helpless, clumsy drawings. Then an incident happened that both of them remembered. In a small district hospital, there was no children's ward, and here on the floor, there was a boy who had had his appendix removed. When his friends visited him, he took them to see Mowgli. Many people associated Tony with this literary hero. It was a good thing Barbara was beside the boy at that moment. She and Tony were playing peacefully when the door swung open. There were several boys standing in the hallway, and one of them, in striped pajamas, pointed at Tony. Here he is, this wild one. Honestly, they found him in the woods. He was attacking people. That's why his hands were cut off. The boys watched with avid curiosity. Tony was confused with surprise. Barbara clenched her fists. Get out of here. Why what? Then Barbara sprang to the door. Before the boys could enter the room, she slammed the door so hard that it hit one of the mockers in the face. He howled in pain, and it was clear that the whole pack was going to attack the girl. Tony struggled to rise, but then Barbara squealed so shrilly and on such a high note that the footsteps of running nurses were immediately heard in the corridor. They could have beaten you up, said Tony to his friend as the mischievous boys were led away to another room. The girl shrugged. So what, you're just gonna give up? It's kind of disgusting to clutch your paws when you're being treated so meanly. Tony remembered her words many times later. His own mother visited him only once, shortly before he was discharged. She brought him a bag of gingerbread, which was the usual treat they bought him at home. Tony had seen so many new things lately that he thought his old life was behind him and he would never return to it. But here she was, his mother, sitting beside him in her fur coat that exuded familiar smells. She seemed a stranger here. Her place was out there in the woods. So how are you feeling? Asked the mother awkwardly. It hardly hurts anymore, he replied cautiously. Indeed, compared to the pain he had experienced in the first few days, Tony had nothing to complain about now. Did they take away all your fingers? My mother said. Tony's hands were bandaged, so Lucy hadn't seen what they looked like yet. All, answered he. So what do we do now? It was his mother who asked him. Tony was afraid to think about how to live his life. And most of all, he didn't want to be alone with his mother. She'd forget to prepare the food. If his father didn't remind him, little Tony would often go hungry. Then he learned to cook the simplest things himself. And now how? You'll have to worry about your pension. My mother decided you'll get an invalidity group. Then you'll get a survivor's pension for your father. I won't send you to boarding school. What's good in a boarding school among strangers? Maybe you'll give it to me? Tony suddenly asked. I'm no help to you now, only a burden. Come on, my mother said. We'll get by somehow, and strangers will only abuse a cripple. So come on, son. When you get better, we'll get all the papers and I'll take you home. We should think about it. Maybe we'll sell the house and buy somewhere in the country. Tony felt sorry for the house his father had built, but he realized that his mother could hardly manage the household alone. And to live away from people when he could not help her in anything was not a good thing. No matter what, he had to move. You tell me at least how the funeral went, he asked. If they pay me money, let's put a nice monument to my father. Don't feel rich just yet. There was a sneer in his mother's voice. The dead, Tony, don't mean anything. It's the living. My father saved me, Tony said quietly. If it wasn't for him? Suddenly he realized that if his mother had to choose between the two of them, she would definitely prefer his father to survive, especially since the son was crippled. Barbara was also thinking about the fate of her new friend. Until then, She had lived a measured life, where every day brought some small joys. She loved both her parents equally. Her father worked as a veterinarian and often allowed his daughter to accompany him on trips. And Barbara, even though she was still a little girl, thought that when she grew up she would also treat people or animals. And she wanted to heal Tony too. But what alarmed her most was that whenever she visited her friend, she never had visitors. Neither friends nor, even more strangely, his mother. "Mom, let's take him for ourselves," she asked Catherine, "and Tony will be good, and I have more fun." "But who would give him to us?" Ekaterina's voice sounded unusually serious and sad. "He has a mother. She has other plans for her son." "Well, maybe we'll take him with us for the summer, eh? His mom doesn't take him anywhere. We'll take him to the sea. It'll be good for him, won't it, Mom?" "We'll see there, Barbara," and Catherine turned the conversation to another topic. Meanwhile, Lucy began to carry out her plan. She acted inefficiently, but she had the desire, but no worldly sense. Tony was indeed granted a disability group and a pension. The money was to be put on a card. But the sale of the house didn't go well. Everyone recognized that it was a good house, but there was no second Harvey willing to settle in the middle of nowhere. The offers came in such a way that they could not be called anything but mockery. Somebody offered to buy the hut for scrap, for a pittance, which Lucy would not have enough for the poorest house in the village. Somebody wanted to set up a hunting hut here to keep warm in winter and sleep in summer, and they gave sense too. So Lucy, when Tony was discharged, brought him back to his old home. "I won't be in a hurry to sell it," she said. "I don't want to go too cheap. Your father put his heart and soul into this house when he built it." But now she had all the household chores that her father had previously taken on. So she warned Tony, "I'll cook food, but I don't have time to take care of you, to feed you, to drink you, so learn to eat on your own." And the boy started, as they would say it now, developing self-care skills. He not only learned to cope with many things without help, but also did some simple housework. Often things would fall on the floor, sometimes broken. Lucy would swear, but most of all Tony didn't want to feel like a helpless invalid. He knew that Barbara would not come to visit him here in the forest hut. So he asked his mother, "Let's save from my pension. Maybe there's some transportation for people like me. We can go to the village or even to the district center. I'm responsible for you now, so I'm going to spend it as I see fit." Tony's eyelashes fluttered resentfully. His father had never spoken to him like that, not even when he was very young. His mother seemed to have taken a dismissive tone once and for all. But the worst of it was that, seeing no prospects, Lucy began to drink again, and the more she got involved, the more she dreaded going back to the village. You can't hide the fact that you're drunk from morning till night. There would be commissions. She remembered well how it had been for her. Tony would eventually be taken away from her and put in some boarding school. Or worse, there'd be a family who want to adopt him. They'll take the pension. And what would Lucy have to live on? She'll be despised in the village. She lives in a poor family, has no parental rights, drinks every day. Compared to Catherine, she's a real bottom. And there'll be nothing to drink on. It's a vicious circle. She won't get a job because she's an alcoholic, and there's no money to buy alcohol. It's a very bleak prospect. And Lucy had an idea. One day she worked from morning till evening, clearing the cellar of all the things that had accumulated in it. Then she brought in a mattress, a low stool, and most importantly, she securely fastened a long dog chain to the wall, 10 meters long. God knows how it got there. Harvey had never had a dog on a chain, so the chain was rusty and heavy. Tony was lured into the basement by his mother without telling him anything, but she had to outline his future when she chained him by the leg. "You're to sit here," she said, "and you're to be quiet. You know how hard it is with you right now. I can't take it anymore, so you better get over it. I'll bring you food. I'll pour the garbage behind you. You won't die." Tony didn't believe it at first. He could see that his mother was drunk again, and when she had too much to drink, it happened to her. She had a temper, and sometimes she could say the most outrageous things. He figured she had a bad day, and it would all blow over soon. Tomorrow, or maybe today. In a few hours she would cool down, let him off the chain, and even ask for forgiveness. All we have to do is not to annoy her. But Lucy took the decision to hide her son from the world seriously. At first, when it first flashed through her mind, it had seemed wild. But once she'd gotten used to the idea, she would feed and water Tony. "He's young, he won't die." She would withdraw money from his card for what she needed. Of course, from time to time, she would be asked about the fate of her son, but in the village everyone was her own. They would take her word for it that everything was all right with the boy. It was a common practice here, and the post office could give a registered letter not to the addressee, but to his neighbor, who promised that he would take the envelope to the address. And family members received money for each other. Sometimes the granddaughter signed for the grandmother in the statement. It's all about trust. Hardly anyone dares to go that far into the woods to check their suspicions. They didn't buy Lucy's house, didn't put a real price on it. Well, that's a good thing. No one to stop her from living the life she wanted. And knowing Tony, she was sure that her son would not scandalize, scream. He would cry and realize that his life was not the worst for a cripple. He's fed and fed, warm. He'll get by without the rest. Lucy did not look far ahead. She would keep her secret from the others as long as she could, and then she would see. Tony never thought his world would shrink to 4 walls, the same basement he used to love so much. It was where the pickles were kept in barrels, and his mother used to send him to get some pickles, mushrooms, sauerkraut, or pickles for supper. On the way, God himself commanded to eat a small pear or a pimpled cucumber. And long shadows danced on the wall, so that the artist's imagination told Tony different scary stories. Now the barrels were empty, and the lantern was a blackmail tool. If Tony behaved badly from his mother's point of view, she would take the lantern away, leaving the boy in the dark. Then all he could do was lie on the mattress, crying or imagining stories to distract himself. And vice versa, in good moments his mother could make him happy, bring him paper, pencils. "Don't waste the album too much," she said. "I won't be going to the village soon to get a new one." Draw in a corner of the sheet, then in another corner, and on both sides. In such moments of enlightenment, she was not averse to fixing a broken pencil, and could be generous with some other gift. The Petrovs are throwing away their books. She shared village news. The children are grown up now. They don't need textbooks, and they don't read anything else at all. The telephone has replaced everything now. So they said, "You want to take it, Aunt Lucy, or we'll take it to the dumpster. I know you like to read, so I brought you a few." At times like this, Tony was almost happy. He had several days of reading ahead of him, when his imagination would take him from the damp cellar to another world. It was useless to ask his mother for anything else. At first, he offered her different options. "Mom, if it's hard for you, I'll go live with one of my uncles. They need you." "No, really, I'll be able to help them someday. I'll learn. At least look after the kids. No one will take you," my mother said, like a cutoff. "Not my brothers, not your father's friends. You see, no one comes here. They've forgotten about us. Who would willingly take a cripple? Think about it. Well, then to boarding school. I'll study there. Don't make it up. Nobody teaches people like you there. They lie in their beds, dirty, wet, and the nurse won't come to change their underwear. And they give them pills to keep them quiet and not to complain. These pills make them stop thinking at all. They just lie there drooling." Tony twitched, and in utter desperation, he was already speaking. "Well, our own shouts at the church. At least there. Old men live there, old women. And I'll be there. What's wrong with you?" Mother snapped at me. "Are you hungry?" "No, you haven't even finished your porridge. You draw whenever you want." "What else do you want? Tell me." Tony sighed deeply. "I want to get out," he said with inexpressible longing, "to look around, to look at the world, to look at the world. What's there to see? Nothing's changed. Same trees standing around. You should have just stayed put." But Tony seemed to understand the reasoning behind it, and one time he pleaded, "Let me sign some paper once and for all that all the money I'm entitled to I give it to you. Do what you want with it, and let me go." He must have hit a sore spot here, because his mother gave him a slap that made his teeth clatter. "Where will you go?" she shouted, rousing herself. "Into the forest to starve to death? Or begging? I'm so good. I gave all the money to my mom. Now give me a cripple with no arms for breadcrumbs? Is that it?" That time she left with the lantern and did not return for a long time. No drawing, no reading. Tony was so sad that his flat, hard pillow was soaking wet. He choked on tears and snot until he was exhausted and fell asleep. He never asked his mother for freedom again. He knew it would make things worse. He slowly began to get better at drawing. Only the paints were easier to work with. He had already learned to hold the brush in his teeth, and now his drawings no longer resembled the scrawl of a 3-year-old child. Sometimes, when his mother forgot to pour him fresh water, he would rinse the brush in the water that was meant for drinking, and then he would drink the water, which smelled of paints, and he would get all tattered. Time passed. He formed a kind of alliance with his mother, a monstrous one, but a monstrous one nonetheless. Since the woman lived alone upstairs in the house, she wanted to talk from time to time. Then she opened the door to the cellar, sat down on the top step. At such times she was often drunk, and she was afraid to go down on unsteady legs. One could roll down and then not get out, and began to tell Tony the news of village life: who died, who was born, who got married, who moved, what they sell in what store, and how much. And although all this news had nothing to do with him now, Tony was still glad to listen to it. It was the sound of a living human voice, and the realization that somewhere there was life going on. People were still doing their jobs, and the whole world had not collapsed. Tony no longer hoped to get out of here, but he was happy for others, especially if something good happened to someone. The priest had his fourth child, the school principal had finally retired, and now she was going to work in the vegetable garden, and the store had brought in cheap flour. But since there was nothing to tell, my mother, under a drunken bar, was drawn to philosophy. "Here, tell me, why do I have such a fate?" she asked Tony. "All in my family drank. No one cared about me." And for the 1,000th time she began to tell how she had almost been taken away from her mother to an orphanage. I could have studied too, and Tony had heard that story many times. I could have gone to the city like some people. I was so good, I could memorize poems and recite them with such an expression that the teacher cried. Now I'd be working in a library somewhere, and my husband would be alive, and my child would be safe, and not all this. Lucy waved her hand and began to cry bitterly, her head in her lap. At such times she looked old and ugly, and Tony felt sorry for her. At the same time, he realized that by the word "some" his mother meant her sworn friend Catherine, but she never mentioned her out loud. Neither her nor, for that matter, her daughter. "How's Barbara doing?" he asked one day. The mother wrinkled her forehead. "Barbara who?" "The daughter of Catherine, the nurse from the hospital," he explained quietly. Mother was in a good mood, so she condescended to answer. She had a brother. Catherine gave birth to a boy, so your Varika will take care of him. Catherine doesn't have time, she's at work all day, although there's a grandmother there too, so there's support from all sides, so to speak. My mother puffed on her cigarette, her face becoming unkind. I'm sure she was thinking again about why some people get everything and others nothing. Then she dropped the cigarette butt and left, remembering to lock the cellar door. The first time Tony had come here, he had hoped that Barbara would somehow get him out. He'd been worried about where he was, and they'd look for him and find him chained up in the basement. He even mentally called out to Barbara, and it seemed to him that sooner or later she would hear the call. There are telepaths, Hippolytus. Barbara had told him about them once. What if he had a talent for it too? In any case, his desire to get out of the dark cage was passionate. But days, weeks, months, and years went by, and nothing happened. Once a week his mother would come down to take away his dirty laundry and bring him clean ones instead. That's when she was sober. But when she was very drunk, she might not show up for long periods of time. Or she'd unlock the door and she'd be on her feet. Then she'd just throw down some food, pieces of bread, boiled potatoes. He'd pick it up and eat it. Water was worse. Sometimes we had to be thirsty for days. When Lucy would get out to the village and was asked about her son, she would say that Harbizon had taken the boy. She works at the hospital herself, so she took care of the invalid. There the boy is provided with food and treatment. In addition, she sends him most of his pension, leaving only bread for herself. Lucy thought she looked noble, however, at times she began to be embarrassed. You're not just buying bread, you're buying vodka. Probably all the boy's pension is spent on your booze. It's a good thing a relative took Tony in for support. Aren't you ashamed to live on an orphan's pension? You should get a job, Lucy. But the woman didn't even consider that option. She couldn't bring herself to do anything she didn't want to do a long time ago. And with her job, if she missed a day, she'd be fired. Besides, who in their right mind would hire her, seeing the unhealthy bluish color of her swollen face, which gave her away as a chronic alcoholic? Catherine was told by Lucy that she had sent her son far away from here, and Catherine had told her daughter about it. Barbara sighed deeply. She realized that she would probably never see Tony again. What a pity. She was worried about him, how his fate would turn out. And Tony developed a friendship with wolves. Yes, yes, his father had taught him to imitate the wolf's howl. And now, when his mother would go to the village, he'd sometimes raise his voice and the wolves would answer him. They have excellent hearing. If only I knew what they were telling him. It wouldn't have worked in front of his mother, and she'd already almost beaten Tony for it. Why are you baiting predators? We live out here in the middle of nowhere, away from people. No protection from you. You want them to eat me. Who will bring you food then, you unscrupulous? Now Tony knew that his whole life would be spent here, in this basement, and he just wanted it to be over soon. The village boys learned about the ghost in the forest from Archie. He was a hereditary mushroom picker. His mother had raised him alone, and mushrooms were an important part of her income. She knew all the places in the county where the most expensive whites grew, the kings of mushrooms. And at dawn, she'd drive around on her scooter. She never sold them in the village. No one would give her a real price. I took the mushrooms to town, but not all of them. She dried some of them and sent them by mail. She had regular customers. Archie specialized in the simpler mushrooms, such as aspenberries and potberazovics. His mother regularly took him to the hospital for encephalitis vaccinations, because Archie was climbing into thickets where it was hard not to pick up a tick. And this time, in addition to mushrooms, he had one more prey of an amazing imagination bake. I was already going home, and I thought I wouldn't make it to the road before dark. If only to get there, maybe someone would give me a lift. Well, I'm not surprised that wolves howl in the distance. I often hear them. But never once have they attacked me in summer. They go deep into the forest at that time, shun people. They have wolf cubs. And then I passed this hut, not everyone can find it. The one where the hunter died and his woman stayed. The house is dark and there's a howl. What a howl! It was either a man or a beast, and those wolves in the forest answered him. I threw everything, mushrooms, everything that hindered my way. I ran all the way to the road, and I'm afraid to look back. And the worst thing is that I can't see the ground under my feet. It's already dark. I think I'll stumble, fall, it'll grab me. Someone tried to make fun of Archie, saying he was a big guy and made up such nonsense. But the other boys didn't support him. They were all terribly excited. They knew Archie wasn't inclined to lie, and he wasn't afraid of much. If he met a real wolf pack, he'd think of something. Climb a tree, call for help from there. But he wouldn't have lost his nerve. But here, he was struck with real terror. Let's go over there. Somebody's on fire. You got a big mouth. You're telling me you wouldn't be afraid to go out there at night. I mean, who's gonna let you in the first place? Billy was the most desperate of them all, day and all. Well, we'll have to see what's going on. Who will appear to you in the daytime? Is the ghost a fool or what? I don't know what kind of brains he's got, but his folks won't let any of us out of the house at night anyway. I've heard about this hut, but I've never been up there. Could it be the spirit of a dead hunter? Harry, the youngest of them, suggested. What? He turned into a wolf and went to his woman's house to scare her. With laughter, they tried to drive away their fear, for by this time they had already decided that they would go into the forest and try to find out if there was anything strange connected with the ghost in the hut or near it. We just have to wait for Lucy, the hunter's wife, to come to the village, because she won't let us in her yard and barn to look at everything. She'll kick us out. So we wait for her to show up, while she goes to the store, while she visits her family, and we go back and forth. From then on, they watched for the moment when Lucy would come to the village. She usually showed up at least once every 7 to 10 days, and she stayed for a long time. At first, she would go to the magnet and take the cheapest of the hard liquor, but I didn't stock up on food here. For this purpose, there was a small private grocery store where saleswomen often let villagers buy food on credit, writing down in a thick notebook from whom how much is due. There were those who accumulated debts from pension to pension, then paying for everything at once. But Lucy was not welcome here because it was very difficult for her to resist temptation. If she had recently received her son's money, it was simply impossible for her to pay off the sales clerks and thus cut herself off from vodka. The next time she asked in the cherry tree, as the store was called, "Medicines are so expensive now, I bought some for myself, and there are only a few cents left. I'd like some bread, a cheap sausage, and some butter. Give it to me, will you? I'll come back on Wednesday. I'll be sure to cry." "You have good medicines." The saleswoman Elizaveta pulled out a notebook, 40-degree strength, no other way. Look, you already owe 5,000. What are you gonna pay with? You said yourself that you send almost everything to your son. And don't take pity, The shopkeeper told us not to lend you anything more." Lucy was rubbing the collar of her dress and was slow to leave. "Girls, maybe I'll cry with mushroom tea. You give me at least a little flour now, and I'll bring you some porcini mushrooms fresh or dried." Usually the sales clerk would take a bag of flour off the shelf with a wave of her hand and give it to Lucy. It was clear that she was not the kind of beggar who had a bank account, and to send her out of the door was really to condemn her to starvation. And the saleswomen were well aware that she could not control her passion for the bottle. One had a husband who drank, another had a father who drank. From the store, Lucy went to her brother's house. She was not welcome there either, but again she got something. In summer it was surplus crops, overripe cucumbers and zucchini, cracked tomatoes and cabbages, rotten apples, in winter small potatoes and onions. Often the brothers' wives would give the women the clothes they would no longer wear themselves, but in the woods it was the best thing. Who could see Lucy there? After she had loaded herself up and felt like a miner, Lucy would go back. She rested often on the way back. Her body was beginning to give up, her heart was getting worse. Sometimes she thought that she might die overnight and was afraid that she wouldn't be able to get Tony off the chain in time. On the other hand, who would want him without her? She sincerely believed that if now her son's life was a dog's life, it would be even worse in some boarding school. And if that was the case, it was better for both of them to leave at about the same time. Billy was the first to see Lucy coming out of the magnet, and he rushed to gather the other guys. Now they had a few hours to spare. And soon the little brute was moving into the woods. Only Archie was hard to persuade. To everyone's surprise, he was more frightened by the mysterious howl than they had realized. It seemed that he was ready not to go to the side of the woods where the hunting hut stood. The boys would have given up on him. But he was a slave, as they say, not a worshiper. But they had no confidence that they would find the place for themselves. Archie knew the place better than any of them, and he had never been lost. "Did you bring anything with you?" Archie asked. He wasn't understood. A few moments later, Harry, the most sensitive of the boys, realized. Archie was referring to the kind of ghost hunting gear they use in the movies, and if they didn't have any clever devices that tracked the vibrations of electromagnetic waves, or whatever the otherworldly thing was, they could at least bring a cross and holy water. But Archie was too shy to say it out loud. He didn't want to show himself a coward, and Harry again understood that and kept silent. The boys were going to see and maybe even experience the thrill. Moreover, they were not afraid, because it was a sunny day and the forest was all around, in which they felt at home as country boys. They knew what kind of trees, bushes, herbs, distinguished poisonous mushrooms and berries, and the most unpleasant adventure so far for them was a meeting with an adder. And now Archie was leading them confidently down a narrow, not-so-subtle path. "She's crazy to live so far away," said Billy. "What if something happens? She drinks like I don't know who. If she dies, the wolves will find her before people do." "There's another road there." Archie turned around. "It's on the highway. It's longer if you walk, but then when you turn into the woods, it'll take you about 10 minutes to get to the hut. And I took you the way I took you. It won't be long now." The boys were quiet when they saw the hut. None of them had ever been here before. They had no idea that it had given a very different impression before. It had been in a clearing overgrown with flowers, and it had looked like a fairy tenement. Harvey was fond of carving and spent a lot of time making wooden lace. He also had some livestock, goats and chickens. The cabbages in the vegetable garden were filling up, and the tomatoes were turning red. Now the dilapidated house seemed abandoned if it weren't for the laundry drying on the rope. The broken glass was replaced by plastic sheeting. There was no trace of the vegetable garden, and the wooden laces were torn off or simply rotted. "Look, does she really live here?" Austin couldn't take it anymore. "Maybe somewhere else? You can't live here. So you see, it's even washed. Maybe this laundry's been hanging here for 3 years." Billy clawed at the edge of the decrepit gray sheet. "No, it's still wet, but I know what you mean, Austin. I'd howl worse than a ghost in a place like this." The boys touched the door in case the landlady didn't lock it, and they could see what was inside, but the door was locked. Then they tried to look through the windows. For this purpose, we used an old bench that stood by the porch. They carried it from window to window, stood on it one by one, and greedily gazed at the surviving panes. Inside, the same desolation reigned. In the largest room there was so much dirt or earth on the floor that something was even growing out of it. Food scraps and unwashed dishes, doors hanging on one hinge, a disassembled bed, the shelter of the most unassuming of bums, that's all. I think that only ghosts in here are rats, Austin said thoughtfully. If Tony had been asleep at the time, and he'd long ago confused the time of day and night, he would have missed the boys' arrival, and they were the only ones he could remember visiting the place. But he was awake, and he heard their voices. Instantly, he realized that it was these children who had come here, and he distinguished exactly the children's voices without their mother's permission. Lucy would never have let them in here. And now he would have heard her shouting. She would have chased the intruders away, cursing them. So his mother wasn't home. Tommy listened for a few minutes, trying to believe he wasn't hallucinating, and then he grabbed the poker his mother had brought him to keep the rats away, and started hitting everything on the cellar wall, on some iron pot that had somehow ended up in the corner. He pounded the poker and shouted as loud as he could. Hey, 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 come here. The boys ran away. They didn't wonder who it was. They were frightened by the scream. They had entered a stranger's house without permission, and they feared the man as much as the ghost. That strange woman could have put anyone in her house, and they had better get away quickly. Tony had unknowingly guessed the feelings that swept over the boys. Don't be afraid. I'm alone here. I'm in trouble. I need help. They stopped quite far away and listened to his voice, which they heard already so faintly that they could not distinguish all the words. It sounded like it was calling for help, Billy said uncertainly. Yeah, it's just to catch us. Archie sniffed and said firmly, don't fall for it. It's a scam. Come on, let's go look. It was a chance for Billy to show he was braver than the others. Too bad we didn't bring a knife just in case, or at least a stick. He lashed out at Archie. What kind of mushroom hunter are you without a knife? At least a small one. Okay, guys, come on. If anything, we'll get out of there right away. The place where the prisoner languished, however, was first discovered by Austin. Looks like that's where he was yelling at us from, guys. Now they stood in the small crowd at the entrance to the basement. I'm here. Tony's voice came up again. The boys realized that the person calling them was down there somewhere and couldn't seem to get upstairs. Uncle, how are we going to get to your place? Shouted Harry. There's a locked door. The lock is hanging. Tony froze for a few seconds, unable to find something to say. No one ever came in here. His mother, however, remembered to lock the door when she was away. Too much was at stake. What happened to you, Uncle? Can you hear us? Harry called out. I'm sick. I can't go out on my own. Don't be afraid of me. Take a stone, try to break the hinge, break the door, open. Yeah, and then you're gonna say we're trespassing. I'm not going to tell. Tony begged. Guys, let's hurry up, huh? Or she'll be back. He didn't bother to explain who. They understood it already. Tell you what, Billy decided. Let's give it a try. If that aunt complains, we'll say it happened. There's a lot of us that believe us. What is she? She's a drunk. We can't trust her. He looked around, picked up a heavier stone, and struck. It took a while. The boys were shifting. Harry's fingers shook off and he whimpered softly. In the end, the lock was knocked off by Archie. There were steps leading down there, and there was a light on. They cautiously descended one by one, ready to rush back down at the slightest danger. The boys had not seen much in their lives, but this sight shocked them. One look at this man of indeterminate age was enough to realize that he lived here. Mutilated hands and feet, hair below the shoulders, a beard that had grown for God knows how long, and an iron chain. For a few moments they could not say a word. These guys had not read Robinson Crusoe or The Count of Monte Cristo, but they realized that they had witnessed something monstrous. How long have you been sitting here? Billy asked, his voice sounding hoarse for some reason. He didn't know whether to address the man as you or you, but the man was so helpless that you came naturally. A long time ago, Tony shrugged helplessly. If he wanted to, he couldn't say how long he'd been imprisoned. Then it dawned on him, I was like you now when I was. Who? Now it came out in a whisper. The boys guessed. This middle-aged aunt, whom they had never thought of in any way, because she was spoken of in the village with nothing but squeamish pity, this aunt was capable of. Now they could not look at her without horror. She is, isn't she? Who is she to you? Asked Austin. Mother, listen guys, Tony tried to make sure that the guys, no matter how confused the feeling was, would remember what he was going to tell them. Do you know where my uncles live? There's a blue-roofed house by the church. If it's still blue, Tony's been down for a moment. Tell them I'm alive. Tell them to come get me. And if they don't want to, then find Barbara. Her mom works at the hospital. Her name's Catherine. She's the head nurse there." In his mind, Catherine was still very young, and Barbara was still a girl. It seemed to him that the world had frozen for the time he'd been sitting here. And the boys looked at Sasha. "That's my sister," he said. "Barbara, that is. And Catherine is my mother's name." Tony fixed his eyes on Sasha as if he were his own and continued talking, mostly to him. "If she doesn't believe you saw me give her this," he awkwardly rushed over to a stack of what the guys mistook for damp paper, started throwing it around. Involuntarily, everyone moved closer. They were paintings, but they were painted as if by an alien. It was clear that here was a forest, here was a river, and here was a meadow. Only the river was sometimes green, in the forest grew some fantastic trees, and in the meadow hopped unknown animals, a little resembling hares. Tony drew from memory, and with the colors he had. "I found this." Tony pointed to a sheet of paper with a picture of a girl about 10 years old. You could see how much the artist cared about the image. The paper was worn and stained in some places, but the drawing had been restored over and over again. Harry recognized his sister immediately. At home, there were pictures from that time in an album. "I knew her a little," Tony explained, "when I was in the hospital." "How is she now?" "She doesn't live with us now," Harry explained. "She's at school in the city, but she'll be here soon. She's getting married, and she wants to live with us for a while, because then she won't have to." It seemed to Harry that there were tears in the prisoner's eyes. "You tell her. Just tell her I'm alive, and then it's up to you." "Wait, Archie was afraid. We'll leave now, and that your mother will come. She'll see that the door was broken. What's she gonna do to you?" Tony didn't know. He knew only that his mother would not allow her secret to be revealed. Barbara managed to follow the path her mother dreamed for her. She was the best student at school, well-read, responsible, and diligent. For the first time in several years, the village school had a gold medalist. Barbara was determined enough to apply to medical school right away, by passing medical school. Even her mother didn't believe she could get in. The competition was too high, but Barbara got in. For the next few years she lived in a dormitory. Her parents suggested renting an apartment so that she could study in peace, but luckily the girls in the room were serious. Barbara sometimes thought they couldn't stand the strain of so much work. The lights were turned off at midnight. They got up at 5 in the morning. When the girl came home, she had no strength to communicate with her relatives. She slept off, vowed only to eat, and again, like a zombie, wandered to bed. After a couple of years, however, Barbara became so involved that she started working part-time at the hospital in the evenings. Her friends discouraged her, telling her that her studies would be enough for now. It was the last opportunity to prolong her childhood. Soon they will all plunge into work with their heads. It is well known that very few doctors work on one rate, more and more on 1.5 and 2. But Barbara did not give in and increasingly stayed on night duty. She wanted to see if she had chosen the right profession. She wanted to learn the practical skills that young doctors lacked. And of course, the money she was earning was not superfluous either. Barbara had not forgotten Tony. She had been sad and worried about her friend for a long time after their meeting. And when she was told that Tony had gone to his relatives and was unlikely to return, she looked for a chance to get his address and to give him a letter. If he's learning to draw, maybe he'll adapt somehow and be able to write at least a short reply, she thought, or dictate to someone what he wants to say. A few times she even managed to trip Lucy up. "How's Tony?" she asked, walking up to the woman in the store. "Good," the boy's mother answered one-wordedly. "Here, please give this to him. You're visiting him, I suppose. Or send it to him." Barbara held out a piece of paper. In her message, at the bottom, she remembered to write her own address. "Okay," agreed Lucy. She stuffed the girl's letter into her pocket, only to toss it into the nearest trash can later. Barbara had never once dared to ask her about Tony, to ask for his address. Over the years, the memories of the boy had faded, but, returning her thoughts to her distant childhood, Barbara reminded herself of a scuba diver who had plunged to the maximum depth, and everything around her seemed unreal. The only thing left was a light sadness. Barbara hoped that Tony was doing well and had somehow adapted to life, and happiness smiled on him. Perhaps he could have called out to her from afar, but he didn't, and so she was a thing of the past for him. And then, already in her senior year at the Institute, during another night duty, Barbara met Max. He was a young doctor, desperately worried at heart about whether he could cope, so he put on an air of deliberate equanimity. Barbara immediately realized that Max was very talented. He lived medicine and talked about it with passion. And they felt trust in each other. Both were still on the threshold of science. Both had a lot to learn. They shared their doubts and were proud of small successes, encouraged each other in failures, and soon it became something vital for them to call each other in the evening and tell each other how the day went, to ask for advice, to remember something funny. In the summer, they went to the sea together, and Barbara returned so happy that her mother did not have the heart to reproach her daughter, for she had waited for Barbara for a long year and dreamed that she would spend all her vacations at home. But she had to accept the inevitable, and Barbara began her own life. The young people did not talk about the wedding. It was already as if it was a matter of course that they would stay together. It was only at the end of the following spring that Max said, "We should probably apply now. When you start working, we'll probably only meet at the hospital, and at night you'll be on duty, and I won't be able to get married there." And this time Barbara came home not just for fun, but to discuss with her parents what was going on. It was decided that the young people would get married in the city, and there they would organize an evening in a cafe, to which Barbara's parents would also come. And then, a few days later, they would set the table here in the village, so that all those who had known Barbara since childhood could come. If Barbara had a little sister, she would be interested in the bride's lush dress and jewelry, smell the perfume, and try on heeled shoes. But the girl had only a brother, and with a great difference in age, and all these girlish trinkets Harry did not care about. That's why Barbara was surprised when her brother called her in for an important talk. She'd had to take on the role of Sasha's advocate many times before, and to present his misdeeds to his parents in such a way that the punishment was not too severe. Right now, she thought her brother had done something wrong again. "Well," she asked, covering the door, "what now? Did you break a window? Or got into a fight?" "Varia, do you remember Tony?" Harry decided to be direct. Barbara flinched so violently that her brother realized the question had struck her, and the girl couldn't understand how Harry had gotten hold of this story. Her mother had forgotten everything a long time ago, and for her it was a sore subject, and she never remembered her friend, never said his name out loud. "Is there something you want to tell me about him?" Harry had never seen his sister so excited before. "I'll tell you everything, but don't swear. The boys and I went to catch a ghost like fools. And there he was, on a chain, you know." And Harry told the whole story. When it came to the cellar, Barbara cried like a dead man. She couldn't stop. Fearful, with swollen lips, she was no longer wiping away her tears, and she was sobbing. It was like she couldn't breathe. Harry realized he was going to kill her with this, but he couldn't hide it. He pulled the folded drawing out of his pocket, unfolded it, and placed it in her lap. When Barbara saw it and realized that it was her, that Tony had drawn it, she threw back her head and squeezed her eyes shut as if in unbearable agony. "Harry, I'm trashy." Her voice was just a little audible. "I got over it so quickly and stopped looking for him. If I was looking for him, Speaking, she could no longer speak. Harry touched her arm. "Varia, the guys and I agreed to tell you first, because you two seem to know each other. What should we do next? We should probably tell the police to go there." He waited for her to answer, but it took her a moment longer to gain control of her voice. "I'll go over there. You don't know where it is, and that woman is a freak. I've never been afraid of her, but now, I'm afraid of her." Barbara's never spoken to her brother like this before, as an equal, forgetting she's older. "I'm afraid Lucy will do something too. She won't be afraid of me, but if the police, I don't know what she might do. She's already in the middle of it. She saw we were there. The door's broken. So should we go now?" Barbara was ready for that too. "If we go alone without Archie, I'll be fine in the light if I can find my way. It's early in the morning. Let's do it at 4 o'clock. I'll wake you up. But we can't get him out of there with just the two of us. You think Aunt Lubia won't wake up when we drag him out of there? You want to fight her or something? I'll go with the phone. If anything happens, I'll call the cops from there. Harry, don't you understand? He's got his life hanging in the balance." And Harry only had to wave his hand and say, "You're thinking nonsense, sister, but so be it." When she returned from the village and saw the cellar door open, Lucy was numb. She thought that sooner or later someone would come here, at least some lost hikers or mushroomers. And it might happen that she'd be talking to them and Tony would raise his voice. Or, even more frighteningly, someone would start seriously inquiring about his fate. Not the villagers, of course, but someone from the authorities. But she hadn't expected her secret to come out like this. She didn't need to guess who was here, because Tony could tell her everything. She tossed the bags, which had seemed so heavy a moment ago, but now, on adrenaline, were like fluff. And without thinking about the possibility of slipping on the steps, she rushed downstairs. "Who came to see you?" Lucy didn't recognize her own voice. Tony shrugged, hiding his fear quite successfully. "Some guys. I don't know how I know them. I don't know what they wanted. They were stupid. Maybe they were looking for treasure." If Lucy had not been in such a state, she would have laughed a horde in her kind of house. "What did you tell them?" "That it's hot outside and it's cool in here. So I came down here to paint. They didn't see my chain, I was sitting on it, and I covered it with a blanket." Tony had thought about that legend in the time his mother had been away. It was a good thing the boys had told him it was a hot summer up there. But Lucy couldn't believe him. There was too much at stake. It was like she was looking at the basement through someone else's eyes. There was too much to tell that Tony hadn't just come down here for a while, that he lived here. A mattress with a flat, dirty pillow and a rag instead of a blanket, a night pot, leftover food, and the guy himself, overgrown like a hermit. Even if the guys didn't see his chain, in any case, they'd spread the word that Lucy had some crazy person living at her place, hiding from people. And there's no telling what's gonna happen. The woman hadn't thought so fast in a long time. She climbed up without a word to her son, and Tony could only wonder what would happen next. The mother went back in fast enough. "You're coming with me now," she tossed to Tony. He staggered back. "How's that?" "I'll take the chain off now. And then I'll make you crawl or crawl. It's up to you, just hurry up." Tony was so confused that he didn't think straight for the first few minutes. When he got out of the basement, he had the feeling of being on another planet. He had forgotten the world completely, and though his legs could walk, he just couldn't walk. His mother poked him in the shoulder. "Come on. Where do you want me to go?" Tony hadn't noticed that his mother was drunk, but he knew that in fact her mind had long since gone. That way, the mother pointed to the woods. She had the sense to realize that Tony couldn't walk very far, and she couldn't drag him, but it was absolutely necessary to hide him, at least for a while. And then we'd have to see how things went. Maybe it would be possible to go back to her old life, but not now. The two of them made their way to an inconspicuous spot in the woods where his father's old hunting tent stood. "You can sit here for a while," your mother said. And at once, as if with a knife cutting off all hope of escape, of release, of his being able to call for help, she threw coldly. "If anyone comes looking for you, I'll shoot them. I don't just have a tent, I still have my father's gun." "What are you going to do?" Even Tony, who knew his mother best, couldn't believe she was capable of that. "What did you think? If they find out about you, I'm going to jail. And I don't want to go to jail. So we'll settle everything here, with you and with me. Don't you dare call anyone." She made one last threatening remark. Tony lay in the tent for the rest of the day. He was not well. If his mother had given him such a gift earlier, she would have let him out, even for a little while. With what delight he would have looked at every blade of grass, remembered the flowers, inhaled the slightly perceptible odor that remained in the tent, that reminded him of home and of his father. But now he was trapped. He wouldn't get far. His legs were crippled too. So when the danger to his mother was over, she would put him back in the cellar, and that would be that. We could go all the way. From here he could hear if someone came to his house, started talking to his mother. His hearing's gotten very thin. He could yell at the top of his voice, make himself known. His mother might decide to take up a gun, and even if she did, it was not certain that it would hit. But if she shot someone because of him, how would he forgive himself later? And his mother was apparently so excited that she didn't think to bring him any food or water. Tony didn't sing songs with the wolves that night, though if he could have, he would have lured them to him as easy prey, so down he was. The only thing he decided to himself was that he would not return to the cellar. Better here to starve than there in the dreary and stinking half-darkness. He wouldn't go, that's all. Even if his mother dragged him, he would cling to every root, every branch that came out of the ground. Dawn was approaching. The thought of taking Rocky's old dog with him occurred to Harry at the last minute. Barbara objected sharply. "Why, he's a fool, not even a hunting dog. He'll bark at the most inopportune moment. If Lucy doesn't have dogs of her own, She'll figure it out in no time. Rocky is smart. Harry rubbed the dog's backside. Varia, I'm not very clear with the road. Rocky will lead him back in case of anything, like a shoelace. Barbara only flashed her eyes in his direction, trying to control herself. She was terribly nervous, but there was no need to delay. It was beginning to get light already. You could probably see all the trunks of the forest clearly. And like the last time, Harry wasn't afraid at all until he and Barbara reached the fort, where one path led to the highway and the other to Lucy's hut. Rocky trotted quietly ahead, sniffing the ground. Not once did she bark or whine. Harry put his finger to his lips. Now if we speak, it should be in a whisper, he said to his sister. She can hear us from here. He wanted to ask his sister what she thought she would do if Lucy fixed the door and they couldn't get down to the basement silently. His only hope was that Barbara would see for herself that Tony couldn't be reached silently. They would go back and raise the alarm. Harry pulled out the crumpled drawing again, and Barbara hadn't noticed he'd taken it with him. Look for it, Rocky. He shoved the sheet toward the dog's muzzle. At home, Rocky once found slippers, which are lost somewhere in the corner under the bed. But here, poking her nose in the drawing, she whimpered a little audibly, as if realizing that the louder you can nod and turn somewhere in the grass. Stupid dog. Now Harry was angry too. Where are you pulling? We're over there, okay. They'd already gone far away, and Rocky stood there, looking away, not understanding what these people wanted. You said to look for them. Here is the clearing where the hut stands. It is quite dawn now, but the mistress is probably still asleep. She has no cattle that would be hungry early, and if Lucy had a good meal last night, God knows when she will wake up. Nevertheless, Harry held Barbara back. Stay away from the house. Let's get out of here. You see, you can see everything from the windows. If Lucy looks, she'll see it right away. You see the barn over there, as if it were on a hill. There's the entrance. From that side, you can't see it from here. I'll go see if the door's open. Maybe she's tied it up with some rope. If we can't go downstairs, I'll at least whisper to Tony that we'll get him out soon. Harry couldn't hold his sister back. Barbara crept toward the house, ducking as if that would help her. The boy bit down on his fist as the girl disappeared around the corner. Barbara stood in front of the dark entrance to the basement. The door was still hanging on one hinge. She could go down, but something told Barbara that Tony wasn't here. It was like calling out to the darkness, and the void answered. She had to change the whole plan on the fly. What to do now? She instinctively turned around. Lucy was standing on the porch with a shotgun. They recognized each other instantly. Lucy knew whose daughter she was, but she didn't hesitate to pull the trigger. If Harry had rushed to his sister, Lucy would have taken him down with the second shot. She had a double-barreled shotgun, but he dashed into the woods before the mistress could see him. His hands were shaking as he pushed the buttons on the phone. He'd never called the emergency services before. Call what? An ambulance? Police? 911? He didn't remember afterward which option he'd chosen, which buttons he pressed. The Tonys didn't want to let Barbara in. First of all, she was in a different ward. He's in trauma, she's in surgery. And who else would help him get from one building to the other? Secondly, Tony was taken to the hospital to be examined, treated for a while, and to determine his fate. Barbara's life was in doubt for a few days. Catherine could never forget how the young, impressionable surgeon came out of the operating room pale, with tears in his eyes. He did not ask who those people were waiting for him in the corridor, who they were to the girl. The operation was still in progress, but they let him go, realizing that he might collapse. That's the kind of hole in the chest, he said, as if to himself, and waved his hand, in fact, already Trump. Barbara was in intensive care for a week, and then only her mother was allowed to visit her in the ward, and only for a short time. When the girl was allowed to visit, she couldn't believe her eyes. The door opened awkwardly, and Tony appeared on the threshold in a wheelchair. They hadn't seen each other in so many years, and yet he was the same, only grown up. Barbara could at most awkwardly raise herself awkwardly on the bed toward him. They embraced, and for a long time they couldn't unclasp their hands, like two soldiers surviving a battle. You never found it, the first thing Barbara asked. Tony immediately realized it was about Lucy and shook his head. Who knows where she's gone? Mother knows the forest well. If she shows up in the surrounding villages, people will turn her in. Everyone already knows. He stroked her hair as gently and awkwardly as if his hand were a bear's paw. "You're gonna get better, aren't you?" Barbara nodded. "I'm sorry, I'm really stupid. I should have done what Harry said, and I decided on my own. You've all been worried sick." The door opened without knocking and Max walked in. Barbara wanted to say something, but seeing that she had a guest, Max disappeared down the hall. "Tony, you won't go back there again, will you?" Barbara asked excitedly. Now she was holding her friend by both hands. "I'm not even talking about the forest. I'm talking about the village. You can't go there. One thing is that your mother goes there anyway. Second, you've seen so few good things in life that you can't go to people who don't care if you're there or not. Just curiosity. Remember when they called you Mobley? You'll live with us, right?" Tony saw the looks that Barbara and Max exchanged. It was a moment, but it was enough for him. Except that Barbara couldn't be upset right now. "Look over there," he said. And he smiled at her, and his eyes were dry. There was only one home for the disabled in the whole neighborhood, and that was lucky because not every neighborhood had one. Tony thought the conditions here were heavenly. He lived in a room for two with an elderly uncle, also a wheelchair user, as a neighbor. Quiet sometimes, wouldn't say a word all day. But that's what Tony needed. He was used to talking too much. But his bed was by the window, and you could look out as much as you wanted from the second floor, and from the second floor you had a view of the yard, and of the road that was just beyond the fence, and of the village that lay in the distance. And under the window there was a rowan tree. Now, in winter, its branches were covered with snow, and there were no more berries left, and the birds had pecked them all up. So Tony hung up a feeder, and several times a day he climbed heavily onto the windowsill, opened the window and fed the birds. And here you didn't have to wait for food to be brought to you, as Tony's neighbor did, but you could go to the dining room 3 times a day. And there was a library here, and since Tony had been in the paper and had gotten fame, which he didn't want, they gave him paints and paper and made sure he never ran out. In the library his drawings were already hanging on the walls, and the head promised to organize Tony's exhibition in the House of Culture. Well, that was up to Burr. The former prisoner's world was overflowing with impressions. Sometimes it seemed more than enough. He even wanted to be in Simon's. And when his neighbor's children came to visit him who had put him here, Tony would go to the farthest corner of the corridor, which the patients didn't like. The air was blowing mercilessly here, and in winter the sofa by the window was always empty. Tony didn't even notice that it was cold in here. He was used to everything in his basement. For the first time since his childhood he had a Christmas tree, and he had never seen such a tree before. It was under the ceiling, all decorated with toys and chains, all lit up. They called him to help decorate it, but he only shook his head, afraid of breaking a single fragile toy with his awkward hands. And on the last day of December, he came to the hall where the Christmas tree was in the morning, when the other patients were still asleep. It was the most grand room they had here. Yellow carpet on the floor, airy curtains, several soft sofas, a piano. Sometimes school children came to the House of Invalids with a concert, singing, reciting poetry. And yesterday Barbara sent him a New Year's greeting. She recorded a video. She and Max decided to celebrate New Year's Eve in Prague, and they stood on a very beautiful old square. It was dark, but all the lights were on. Young people so cheerful, beautiful, and Barbara was laughing at him and waving her hand and was so happy. And there were children frolicking around, some in carnival costumes, some just like that. Tony thought of the children and suddenly noticed a little girl in the corner, as if summoned by his thoughts. She was sitting in her wheelchair, looking at the Christmas tree carefully and seriously. "What are you doing here?" he asked, as softly and affectionately as he could. "I'm making up a fairy tale," said the girl. "What else is there to do?" "I'm making up something magical." "And you tell me, and I'll draw a picture to your tale," he offered. "Tony, I won't laugh. Just no way." She looked at him, incredulous at first, and then her gaze softened. "You really won't?" "Well, okay then." And so ended December, and a new year was on the doorstep.
Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.